Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Thursday, October 13th. This is Africa 54.
UN report reveals countries with poor early warning systems see a much greater mortality from disasters than countries with strong measures. The 7-year conflict in Burkina Faso displaces nearly 2 million people and puts many more in need of aid. And NATO discusses ways to bolster Ukraine's air defense systems in order to protect citizens against Russian missiles.
A United Nations report for weather and disaster risk reduction reveals that extreme weather and climate disasters are multiplying, yet half of all countries worldwide lack advanced early warning systems. Paul Ndiho has more.
Proper early warning systems for floods, droughts, heat waves, storms, and other disasters allow planning to minimize adverse impacts. However, a new study released by the UN agencies for weather and disaster risk reduction found that countries with poor early warning systems on average see 8 times greater mortality from disasters than countries with concrete measures.
People need adequate warning to prepare for extreme weather events. That is why I'm calling for universal early warning coverage in the next 5 years. Early warning systems and the ability to act on them are proven lifesavers.
As the world copes with the increasing impact of climate change, we are seeing more disasters that have compounding and cascading effects. Yet, fewer than 50% of the world's least developed countries and only 1/3 of small island developing states have multi-hazard early warning systems. The UN Assistant Secretary General for Africa says climate emergency is dangerous to peace and security.
And although there is no direct link between climate change and conflict, climate change exacerbates existing risks and creates new ones. Africa, the continent with the lowest total greenhouse gas emissions, is seeing temperatures rising faster than the global average. Africa lies at the front lines of the unfolding crisis.
Africa is the continent with the lowest total greenhouse gas emissions, yet it's seeing temperatures rising faster than the global average, according to POBI.
To support the African continent in addressing the impact of climate change on peace and security, we must act on multiple fronts. We can no longer afford to do business as usual. Unquestionably, we need ambitious climate action and accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We look to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November, an African-owned, African-focused COP, for meaningful commitments from the largest emitters.
The UN wants countries to have ready early warning systems within 5 years and to present an action plan during the November COP27 Climate Summit in Egypt. From Dakar to Djibouti, desertification and land degradation erode livelihoods, food security, and millions in the Horn of Africa. Overstating drought also forces families to move far from their homes. After 3 years without proper rainfall in East Africa, close to 20 million people across the region are facing starvation due to drought, according to the UN's World Food Programme. The UN Environmental Programme earlier this year said parts of Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, and Ethiopia were experiencing the driest conditions and hottest temperatures since satellite record keeping began. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
After rejecting a pay offer, the General Secretary of a South African trade union says picketing will intensify. Leading figures in business and politics are warning that a strike will damage Africa's most advanced economy. David Doyle has more.
Rail freight and port workers in South Africa have rejected logistics firm Transnet's pay offer, a union leader said on Thursday. And that means no end in sight for a strike that leading figures in business and politics have warned would damage Africa's most advanced economy. State-owned Transnet said on Tuesday that it had raised its wage offer to 4.5% from 3 to 4% previously. There would be additional 5.3% annual increases over the next 2 years. However, the United National Transport Union and the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union want an offer that is linked to South Africa's annual inflation, 7.6% in August. UNTU General Secretary Cobus van Vuuren said both unions had rejected the pay offer, telling Transnet that they are not being responsible and reasonable. Van Vuuren added that the strike and picketing would be intensifying over the coming days. Transnet has said meeting the union's demands would not be sustainable, as wages currently make up 66% of its total expenses. On Wednesday, 2 trade associations warned of significant knock-on implications for South Africa's economy from the industrial action. In a joint statement, several government ministers also called for an urgent resolution to the dispute, saying it was hitting exports and threatening jobs.
David Doyle of Reuters filed that report. Aid groups say nearly 2 million people in Burkina Faso have been displaced by the ongoing 7-year conflict with armed groups linked to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. That's more than the government's recent estimate of 1.5 million. Advocacy groups say sticking with a lower number could reduce the amount of aid provided for those in need. Henry Wilkins reports from Cosimoro.
In Burkina Faso, informal camps for people fleeing the country's 7-year conflict are an increasingly common sight. Non-profit groups said last month that almost 2 million people are now displaced in the West African country. Shortly afterward, the military government, which fell in a September 30th coup, put the number of displaced at just 1.5 million. The government said it had removed many names from the IDP register. They say they took out people who were counted twice and those who were so well integrated in host communities they could no longer be seen as displaced. Badejo Cissé fled from the country's north around 5 years ago. He says he still feels like a displaced person.
We have to stay here. If the country returns to peace, we would like to go back home. But our village no longer exists, and there are no people there.
Large parts of northern Burkina Faso, including his village, have been ravaged by terror groups linked to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Aminato Ouedraogo lives in Ouagadougou, but government policy does not recognise displaced people in the capital as eligible for support. To receive it, they must go to official camps far from major cities. Ouedraogo says she fled her town of Djibo around 3 months ago, travelling along the road to Ouagadougou, which some call the highway of death due to the lack of security. Their convoy was attacked.
Our convoy got split up and about 40 people who were towards the rear came under fire. My daughter-in-law was injured. She had to be airlifted to Ouagadougou. I won't forget seeing her being thrown across the road by an explosion.
Non-profit groups told VOA they're obliged to work with the previous government's assessment of 1.5 million displaced, which donors sometimes use to determine the amount of aid they give for the country. Alexandra Lamarche is with Refugees International, an advocacy group based in Washington, D.C. She questions the old government's decision to deregister so many IDPs.
But it raises some pretty significant concerns about whether or not the previous government was beginning to deny the real extent of the crisis, which can have real ramifications on the lives of civilians.
It remains to be seen whether the new military rulers, when they form a government, likely next week, will stick with the 1.5 million number. Marine Olivesi is an advocacy manager with the Norwegian Refugee Council. She says the situation in Burkina Faso is increasingly dire, regardless of any confusion around the number of displaced.
Needs are increasing across the board in Burkina Faso. The humanitarian response plan, which was revised in August, shows that there are now an additional 1.4 million people in the country in need of humanitarian assistance compared to the start of the year.
For Cissé, he remains in a kind of limbo. He's not content to live in the camp for the rest of his life, but he has nothing to return to. Henry Wilkins for VOA News, Cosamoro, Burkina Faso.
Chadian ruler Mahamat Idriss Déby is pushing ahead with plans to steer the country back to a civilian government. He has appointed a former opposition figure as prime minister to head an interim administration of national union. Déby named Saleh Kebzabo, 75, a former journalist who ran 4 times for the presidency against his iron-fisted father, Idriss Déby Itno. Kebzabo is promising to accompany the young Itno in a great endeavor, the next 2 years of political transition. Kebzabo, a fierce opponent in the last years of the elder Déby's rule, was swift to recognize Déby's son as the leader after his death.
My first thoughts are obviously with the people of Chad as a whole, with the President of the Republic who has given me this confidence to work together for 2 years to lead the transition. All my party comrades, all my friends and companions of all kinds, and there are many of them, both inside and outside. All freedoms must be respected, starting with the freedom of the press, without which nothing can be done. Human rights in all their forms, human rights, socio-economic rights, freedoms and others, political rights, all this is part of this program. And so we're going to work on it with all our determination, all our enthusiasm, all our goodwill and our will to succeed.
The outgoing premier was 55-year-old political veteran Albert Pahimi Padaki, who had served for 18 months and had also been prime minister under Déby's father. He formally resigned on Tuesday, along with his government. Many students in Sudan are being forced to drop out of school as families' money grows ever tighter in one of the world's poorest countries that's plagued by political instability, droughts, hunger, and conflict. Sudan has an adult literacy rate of only 60%, according to the World Bank. For years, its children have faced mounting difficulties gaining access to a proper education, especially in rural areas. Families struggling with severe economic hardship were already pulling their children out of school under the 3-decade rule of President Omar al-Bashir, who was ousted in April 2019.
The main reason behind dropping out of school is extreme poverty in rural areas. I would like to point out that providing school meals have contributed to their stability. In the rural areas, we have families made up of 3, 6, or 9 people. A father cannot support all of this, and the schools are far away. The father, if he has 5 children, has to provide a breakfast meal, copybooks, and all the supplies which he can't afford. Accordingly, some children drop out, which could make a father pleased because this alleviates the burden and they can now help him out.
We hope there will be no strikes so we can continue to provide classes. Hopefully, it will be a good school year.
Putting them to work is not good. For the future, there is nothing like education. But one is forced to put them to work to at least bring their daily food. But if we can afford education, we will always wish it for them.
It is all about living conditions. If we let them all go to school and we have a big family, I won't be able to provide for the family.
On top of the political and economic instability, devastating floods this year damaged more than 600 schools, delaying the start of the academic year from July until October. Here in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art has transferred ownership of 29 Benin bronzes to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria. The bronzes, which were part of the museum's collection, were stolen from Nigeria during the 1897 British raid on Benin City. Earlier, I spoke to Naire Blackenberg, director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, and I began by asking her how the museum acquired those bronzes.
There's many different ways that we got our collection of 35 bronzes. Some were with another collection, someone with the bequest, some on loan, some we purchased. We've got our collection over the last probably 20 years or so.
So does the act of returning them amount to an admission of guilt for displaying wasn't acquired legally?
No, it was acquired completely legally. I don't think there's any dispute as to whether we were in our legal right to have these objects. The issue is really one more of ethics. When we've displayed these objects, we have indicated that they were part of a group of bronzes that were looted during the 1897 punitive expedition by the British forces. Obviously, we are an American museum. We were not part of that expedition in 1897. But nevertheless, I think the ethical thing to do is to not just look at the conditions of how they got to us as a museum, but the conditions that they were removed in their countries of origin. And so that's the consideration that we're taking right now.
You mentioned the British forces, but initially those artifacts were actually stolen over a century ago. Is this a residual of colonization with the repatriation of these artifacts? And how do the museums now move forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the Benin Bronzes is a well-documented case of colonial forces taking works to assert their power over a particular kingdom or community of people. We are trying to address that, of course, proactively right now as an African Art Museum. Most of the work in our collection of over 12,000 objects are completely ethical, but the ones that are not, we're definitely looking at and taking the steps to address those.
So what mechanisms has the Smithsonian Museum put in place to ensure that artifacts of that kind of nature do not illegally end up at your museum?
It's really important to stress that this is not a question of the law. This is a question of ethics. We know that the law changes over many, many centuries. The Smithsonian does not and has never broken the law in terms of any kind of acquisition processes. In addition, we have a very strict incoming or accessioning process in which we ensure we do not accept anything in our collection without knowing about its provenance right now. We are very strict about what comes into the collection of our museum. That being said, the museums have been collecting institutions for hundreds of years. And so what we're trying to do at the moment with the ethical returns policy that is Smithsonian-wide is to go back through our collection and make sure that things that have already been in our collection and have been in our collection for some time have not been acquired through unethical means.
You know, Naira, that's a step forward, and I like the fact that you're looking at it ethically. How was the ceremony during the handover to the Nigerian government?
It was great. It was wonderful. I mean, we were really, really honored to have our guests from the ministry, the prince from representing the Oba from the Kingdom of Benin, and many, many distinguished guests. We're really proud of it, but it's the beginning of a new step for us, of a reset in our relationship with African artists, African creatives, African communities, and African institutions. So for us, it's the beginning. You know, it's a relief, to be honest. We don't want to have objects that shouldn't be there. We want people to feel comfortable coming into our museums, trusting 100% that everything that we are showing is being acquired in a way that is ethical and legal and right.
That was Naira Blackenberg, the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. We'll be right back.
According to the UN, approximately 800 women die every day from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. This is about 1 woman every 2 minutes. Among countries with the highest maternal mortality ratio since 2017, 9 out of 10 are in Africa. On this week's episode, we will examine some of the other causes of maternal mortality outside of inadequate healthcare on the continent. Join the conversation this week and every week right here on Our Voices.
In other news from the continent, Africa's biggest oil pipeline from Niger to Benin is taking shape. The continent's nearly 2,000-kilometer-long pipeline connects the oil wells of Agadem deposit in the extreme east of Niger to the Benin's port of Seme. Malawian health authorities are calling on the United Nations to assist the Southern African nation with more cholera vaccines amid an outbreak that so far has claimed 128 lives. Nigeria says about 500 people have been killed and more than 1 million are displaced from their homes in the country's worst flooding in a decade after the start of the rainy season. The annual meetings of the boards of governors of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group are ongoing here in Washington Thursday. Officials are discussing global concerns, including the global economic outlook. VOA's Abisan reports from the IMF in Washington.
Esther, today is the fourth day of the International Monetary Fund's annual meetings. As we mentioned earlier this week in the program, the IMF released the World Economic Outlook this year on Tuesday. It predicts a global growth to slow down from 6% in 2021 to 3.2% this year and 2.7% next year. This is largely due to three factors, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the cost of living crisis caused by the persistent and broadening inflation pressures, and the economic slowdown in China. The IMF economists also highlighted, developing countries, or we call it emerging markets, will be the ones being hit the most because of the low vaccination rate and global supply chain disruption, putting more pressure on food supply. One of the sessions I attended on supply chain disruption on Sub-Saharan Africa, the analysts said global supply chain disruption is affecting our region much more than developed countries because consumers in Sub-Saharan Africa spend much higher percentage of their income on tradable goods and also food as in basic life necessities, whereas in developed countries, people spend more on services. As we mentioned on Tuesday, the other main focus of this year's meeting is on debt restructuring, debt relief. In one session, I attended debt restructuring, whether it's too little or too late is a question people often ask. The panelists say it's always too little, too late, because from the creditor's perspective, they rather take a more conservative approach. And also debt relief is not going to get rid of economic issue because it doesn't really generate resources. So the better approach is to combine the means of debt restructuring and try to figure out a way to generate economic growth. And it's really worth to mention that Zambia is one of the first countries made the debt restructuring arrangement with IMF in August. So it could be a template for more countries to go through the same process. IMF also indicates they're trying to get it done by the end of this year, yet there's no clear sign where we are on the terms. So this afternoon, I will try to find out more.
Thank you, Abby. That was VOA's Abisan reporting from the International Monetary Fund meetings right here in Washington, D.C. Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu was recently honored with the prestigious Presidential Lifetime Achievement Award, and it was signed by the U.S. President, Joe Biden. Besides hosting multiple health programs for the Voice of America in English and French, Lino is also the founder of Mildove International, a non-profit organization dedicated to empowering children and youth through education and leadership development while raising awareness and providing support for children with autism in Africa, and the Little Malaika Leadership Program that supports the foundational and leadership skills for boys and girls ages 7 to 12. Lino joins me now to tell us more about her work outside of the studio. Hello, Lino.
Hello, Esther.
Well, it's a Lifetime Achievement Award. What caught the eye of the committee?
I don't know what caught the eyes of the committee, but I know that one Saturday, very early morning, I was on my bed and I received a call telling me that I've been nominated for this award and I needed to submit my bio so it can be reviewed. And I did that, and then I was told that it was approved. So I'm very, very happy, and for me it's a full circle moment because community service is something my parents instilled in us, and I started when I was very young back in Abidjan. And I even remember that when I was a very young teenager, I was a member of the Rotary Club for Teenagers, which is Rotoract, and we used to go out in the community. We did volunteer work, polio vaccination campaign, all of this. So it's just a very good time for me.
It started all the way in Ivory Coast and you brought it here with you, which is very good. Now tell us, you've worked with autistic children, and tell us why this cause is so dear to you and what we can learn about this disease.
Autism is close to me because in my family there is autism. I have a nephew with autism. So it's a cause that is close to my heart. And I think that I took on not only for my family, but also because as an African, I've seen, as a health reporter, I've seen how autism is misconceived, and there is also misconception, misunderstanding about the disease. I receive many messages every time I touch on the subject from viewers saying, oh, this is so enlightening because my child was hidden, they thought he had a curse, and I'm glad I had this information. So it's important for me as well.
Definitely. But turning to your other program, Little Malaika, why the focus on children between the ages of 7 and 12?
We want to instill in children a foundation, right? Nelson Mandela said once that education is a powerful tool that we can use to change the world. And children are the leaders of tomorrow. We want to start at a very young age to give them that foundation so they can be caring and compassionate leaders of tomorrow. So that's why it's important for us to do leadership, education, mentoring, give them the leadership training they need, the educational opportunity they need, and the mentoring support they need.
So you know this is a lifetime achievement award. It means you got to keep working, whether you're 107 years old.
Absolutely.
So what's your next goal? What are you looking to do more than the autism and the Little Malaika program?
What I would like to do more is to be able to get more funding to support more children on the continent with scholarships, because what we do now is very small. And the more funding you have, the more you can do, right? The more impact you can have. So just to expand the reach, not only through education, leadership, and also with autism, raise more awareness, educate more people so they understand that autism is medical, it's science, it's not voodoo, it's not a curse, and that parents stop hiding their children. You know, that children have access to, be it education, special education, be it the tools to help them improve in that condition. So it's just an everyday journey, long life journey, and this is a full circle moment for me.
I'm so proud of you, Lino.
Thank you.
You deserve it. Thank you so much. Besides the so many programs you do, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
All right. Lino Mudu is Africa 54 health correspondent, and that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.